Everybody, welcome. I'm Morgan Higgins from Illinois Humanities. We're so excited to have you all here today. As you're coming in, you're probably noticing that we are recording this session. So please, give us those permissions. We appreciate it. And to get started, I'm going to pass it off to Gabe Lyon, Illinois Humanities Executive Director.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and to the whole Illinois Humanities team. I cannot believe how many folks we get to spend the next part of the afternoon with. I couldn't be more thrilled. I'm hoping by now most of you are already familiar with Illinois Humanities, but I'm just going to go over a couple of the points to put this conversation in context, because it's a special conversation. It's our first time convening like this with this group of folks. And so I just want to kind of get us all started on the same page. And again, like we are together from across the state. It's a very powerful moment. So if you're not already familiar with us, Illinois Humanities, we're closing in on our 50th anniversary, and we were set up to be the state affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. So when we got started as a nonprofit, the idea was federal dollars would come to the state, and they wanted to make sure that Illinois and all states and territories had local control, that on the ground there would be an organization to make sure federal dollars could get out first and foremost to ensure access to the humanities for all residents. Flash forward, we've become much more than a grant-making organization, and that's part of why we're here today. We do grants, we do free public programs, we do education courses for income-eligible adults so that they can earn college credit by taking humanities courses. But one of the things that is clearer and clearer to us is that we can be our best selves by, in part, being in partnership and being part of strengthening our ecosystem, our state's ecosystem of cultural organizations. So we are today, yes, it's called a kind of capacity building workshop, and we have incredible folks with us. But what we are also doing, hopefully, is building community. And so the time you take getting to know each other and listening to each other and following up with one another, that is perhaps just as important, both in the short term and the long term. And speaking of knowing each other and knowing ourselves, it's really important to us at Illinois Humanities to acknowledge that the land from which we are presenting, a number of us are here in Chicago, I am, is made up of territories and lands of the people of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawa nations, and many other tribes that have called our collective current land home, including the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, and the Sacs and Fox nations. I'm sure and hope that most of you already know that these peoples were forcibly removed from their traditional territories, but the lands continue to carry the stories, the resilience, and the tenacity of these nations. And for instance, here in Chicago, we're home to the third largest urban American Indian population and have more than 100 different tribal nations represented. So this is far from the past. It's very much our present. And we recognize that land acknowledgement statements are most meaningful when they're coupled with a commitment to programs and actions that support Indigenous rights. We hope that you will join us as we are on this journey, and we are very glad to both acknowledge our tribal nations and the lands we're on. And I'm very glad to now turn our program over to Morgan Higgins, who is our wonderful Director of Development here at Illinois Humanities, to kick off our conversation. And if you're just joining us and haven't done it yet, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's really, really great to see where everybody's at. Thank you so much. And thanks again to the team.
Thank you, Gabe. Yes, I am Morgan Higgins, Director of Development here at Illinois Humanities. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the second of 4 capacity building workshops. In the chat, you'll see that our colleagues are sharing some of our community norms for our chat today, which are to create a space for multiple truths, to give and receive feedback respectfully, to acknowledge the difference between intention and impact, and to acknowledge that people are in different places in their understandings and learning. So let's be open and generous. We'd like to kick things off today by thanking the funders who have made this wonderful series of capacity building events possible. Illinois Humanities acknowledges support from the Illinois Arts Council Agency. Our capacity building workshops have also been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Democracy demands wisdom. We also wish to thank our other institutional donors, including the Grand Victoria Foundation and MacArthur Foundation, who contribute vital general operating dollars to Illinois Humanities, which support programs like this, and to all of our individual donors who make our work possible. So as Gabe has previewed, we have an amazing program for you today. Not only are we going to get to hear from this dynamic group of funders about their deadlines, their focus areas and application processes, but also about how they are shifting their practices and approaches based on what they're hearing from nonprofits around the state and from people like you all on this call, especially in moments of duress and challenge, which I think we all know a little bit about these days. So without further ado, we're going to kick it off to our first speaker. As these presentations go forward, please feel free to put your chats in the comments, your questions rather, in the chat and the comments, and we will get to them at the end. For a long time, we'll have a nice setting of Q&A so that we can hear everybody's inquiries and get some answers for you. So first up today, we have Jerome Grand, Program Director at the Illinois Arts Council Agency. Jerome, I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to present here today. Thank you to Humanities and all the attendees. It's a pleasure to be here presenting some information about the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and I look forward also to hearing the presentation from my colleagues and learning about other resources here in the state of Illinois. Guess next slide. This is our logo. You may have seen it on the promotional materials of different organizations across the state. And if you go on to the next slide, if you're ever wondering what this logo is, it is based on a sculpture that was done by Richard Hunt called Hybrid Muse. And Richard Hunt is a renowned Illinois artist. And he created this cast bronze sculpture. It was commissioned in 1985 for the 20th anniversary of the Illinois Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. And shortly thereafter, he became the sort of inspiration for our logo. So if you're ever wondering where that logo comes from, now you have the backstory. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, my name is Jerome Grand. I'm a program director at the agency, and I have a background in visual arts. Prior to coming to the agency, I was working in curatorial departments in museums and arts centers. And I joined the agency in 2008 as a consultant, and I focused most of the work on education programs. I've worked on a program with the National Endowment for the Arts called the Education Leaders Institute, which the Illinois Humanities was a partner on this one as well. And I've also worked on a program called the Arts and Foreign Language Education Grant Program that is a partnership with the Illinois State Board of Education. And since 2018, I've been a program director and I oversee other programs as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the history of this agency. We're a public agency and we were created by the Illinois General Assembly in 1965. The agency is governed by a council that is made up of 21 private citizens chosen for their demonstrated commitment to the arts and appointed by the governor. Next slide, please. And our current leadership, Rhoda A. Pierce is the council chair, and Joshua Davis Raporto is our executive director and oversees the agency. Next slide, please. The mission of this agency is to build a strong, creative, and connected Illinois through the arts. And we do that by supporting the Illinois arts sector, by advancing arts education, and by fostering creativity and working artists. Next slide, please. And in this conversation, the humanities asked to speak a little bit about equity and access. So I want to point out to our strategic plan for 2021 to 2026, where one of our main objectives is advancing equity and access. We believe that a commitment to access, inclusion, diversity, and equity is a key area for growth and impact of our agency. If we can continue on the previous slide, I just want to mention some of the things we have done so far is all of the staff has attended an anti-bias training that has been organized by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So we've done that in the fall, and our next step is to gather as a staff to look at our agency's procedures and programs and progress in that direction. Next slide, please. And to give you a sense, I think numbers are always helpful to give you a sense of how we functioned. So this is a slide of our current budget for fiscal year 2022. As I mentioned, we're a public agency, so we receive public funding. The majority of our funding comes from the state of Illinois through the General Revenue Fund, and that's almost $14 million. And then we also get a yearly NEA National Endowment for the Arts grant, a federal grant of about almost $1 million. And this year, exceptionally, given the circumstances, we've also received federal funds, and also an ARP slipping, but it's the American Rescue Plan funds. So we received some additional funding this year exceptionally to help with COVID. And the majority of the funding that you see goes directly to programs. And by programs, I mean funding programs that we offer. And we can go to our next slide. I've listed here our programs. I won't go into all of them today. I don't think we have time for that. But as you're here together, maybe give you a sense of the breadth of the work we have and possibly some programs that you might be interested in applying for in your work. Next slide, please. The main program that we have is called the General Operating Support. And as its name says, it provides general operating support to organizations, arts organizations. And I want to emphasize that the term arts here is a broad term. We cover arts and education, dance, ethnic and folk arts, literature, local arts agencies, media arts, multidisciplinary, music, presenters development, theater, and the visual arts. So I know as a group here, you're more focused on the humanities, but there might be overlap here. So when we talk about arts, you might also see things that are of interest to you, like literature. I think there's an example of one that is both in the humanities and the arts. And this program, General Operating Support, is our, most of our funds, or a big chunk of our funds go to this program, and we fund every year about 700 organizations across the state with funds to help with their general operating support. These are not project-based grants. They're there to help organizations run generally. We want to recognize the good work that organizations are doing, and we found that general operating support is the best way to do that. So that's the biggest program that we have. And next slide, please. We also have other programs that can be education-focused grant programs, like the Arts and Foreign Language Education Grant Program that gives planning and implementation funds to schools to plan either programs in the arts or foreign language. It's a multi-year program. It's quite complex. It's a fantastic program that's also in partnership with the Illinois State Board of Education. And we have other programs like STARTS that provides funding to bring Illinois teaching artists to do hands-on learning workshops and organizations. And we have other programs like Summer Youth Employment in the Arts that provides opportunity for high school students to work in organizations that have received the General Operating Support Grant. These are just examples. There are more. If you can go to the next slide. We also have programs that are catered for individual artists. We have the Artist Fellowship Program that provides $15,000 fellowship awards to recognize the work of artists in Illinois. And then we have individual artist support that provides funding for public programs or professional development for individual artists. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to go over all the programs today. We wouldn't have time for that. But I encourage you to go visit our website for more information. It's arts.illinois.gov, where you will find a listing of all of our grants. Each grant program has guidelines attached to them that goes over all the requirements, all the specificities, and gives you all the details on how to submit an application. And next slide, please. And if you're ever curious to know more information, I am one of 5 program directors at this agency. We all oversee different programs. So if you're interested in a program, there should be a program director listed there that you can contact. And if you have if you're not sure who to contact, feel free to contact me. We also have a general inquiry email address listed where you can send general questions. And also, if you can't remember our address, there's a staff page on our website where you can find all of our email addresses and names for the whole staff too. And lastly, I will encourage you as well to go on our website and sign up for our email newsletter. That is the best way to receive information about our deadlines, the current program grants that are open. We're also on Facebook, if you're on Facebook. And yeah, encourage you to get in touch with us, learn more about the work we do. And that's my basic presentation for today, so thank you. And I'll be available for more questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerome. Next up, we have Angela Rudolph, Vice President of Program and Strategy at the Grand Victoria Foundation.
Thanks, Morven. Hey, everybody. Angela Rudolph. Really excited to talk to you all today. I was excited when the Illinois Humanities folks reached out to ask me to join. Part of it is because I feel really excited to talk about, I guess you say, how times are changing at the Grand Victoria Foundation. Just to give you guys a little bit of background on who Grand Victoria is. We've been around since 1996. A lot of people know us because we are funded in part by the casino that is currently located in Elgin, Illinois. 12.5% of that casino's annual income is directed to Grand Victoria for our annual grant making. We've historically funded in 5 areas that we internally call the 5 E's: economy, education, environment, engagement, and of course, our current sole place-based strategy, the city of Elgin. What makes us slightly different from a number of other foundations in Illinois is that we don't fund direct service outside of the city of Elgin. We fund what we call systems change, and systems change work, more bluntly or simply, is to say we fund work that is focused on kind of changing the reasons why often direct service is needed itself. And that could be utilizing anything from civic engagement work, voter engagement, community organizing, research, policy advocacy, and the like. Having said all of that, everything that I just said to you is frankly going to be changing. And so let's jump into it. Next slide. So in June of 2019, the Grand Victoria staff and the board of directors really had a number of conversations around what kind of organization did they want to work at, what kind of work did we want to fund in the state of Illinois, and how do we really want to lean into the responsibility that comes with the whole idea of philanthropy. And one of the things that they really decided to do was to have a structured process, having a number of conversations with people who not only worked in foundations, but also folks who we were funding and folks who we weren't funding. Foundations that were doing national work and those that were doing work locally, to really figure out how could we be explicit around tackling the issues of race and equity in terms of how we allocate dollars and in our grant processes. All of this took place before the events of 2020, but what we did learn from what happened in 2020 is that we were absolutely on the right path in terms of trying to figure out how can we be more relevant and more urgent in terms of our grant making. And so what we really decided to do was to say that we wanted to center race, racial equity, and racial justice in any of our approaches in the future. Next slide. So enter me. I actually joined Grand Victoria in November of 2020 as the equity director, given the charge that I had to help the foundation figure out how do we take all of these conversations that we've had and make them concrete. And so I basically spent, admittedly, much of last year just doing what I have jokingly called a listening and learning tour, sitting down, talking to people, having one-on-one meetings, group meetings. We did some focus groups at a certain point in time, and really kind of, playing out a number of ideas and scenarios, but frankly, also being silent and asking people to tell us, what can philanthropy do better? How are we making your jobs harder? What are ways we should be thinking differently around how we interact and engage with you? How often do we come talk to you? What are we asking you for? And all of those things we're asking you for, are they even necessary? And how can we make sure that we are giving whatever we can to leverage the resources of the foundation to help you do successful work? And so we came up with this idea that our goal was, we're going to learn together, we're going to come to a consensus, and then we're going to have a shared definition, concept, and principles to guide the work that we're going to do. Next slide. So in order to have a really strong baseline, we identified the two definitions you see in front of you around racial equity and racial justice. Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity could no longer be predicted. And racial justice is really about how do we have a systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. One is about, what would happen if things were different, and one is about what do we do to make sure that things are different. Next slide. And so for us, we wanted to even tease it down even further. And so we partnered with a group called the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity. We jokingly, really not jokingly, look at a document that they put out called Grantmaking with a Racial Equity Lens. And that document itself has become kind of the internal Bible that we utilize at Grand Victoria to help ground all of our thinking and the approach that the grant making that we're going to be utilizing going forward is going to entail. Can you do me a favor, Tess, and drop the link in the chat that I shared earlier? I really encourage people who are looking to partner with Grand Victoria to have a better sense of what our thinking is, to really go and download the document, Racial Justice, Grantmaking with a Racial Equity Lens, as a way to have a really kind of sense of what it is we are thinking about and how we approach the work. As you can see on the concept slide in front of you, racial equity is the baseline that can flow into racial justice. You can do racial equity work without doing racial justice work. You can do both of them simultaneously. You can go back and forth from one to the other. But one of the things we wanted to do is to really put information out there to give people concrete terms and understandings so that they can take a reflective moment to get a sense of whether or not the work that they are doing is going to be in alignment with the work that we are looking to fund. Next slide. We further went on to create some principles to help drive and develop our work and approach. As I've already shared, we committed to basically be explicit about race and equity when we talk about problems and solutions that we want our grant making to be able to address. We collect, analyze, and use information about race and ethnicity to inform our strategic, operational, and grant making decisions. We acknowledge the historic role of race and racism in social and economic outcomes, and we try to be as intentional as possible to address the racial history by focusing resources on building and increasing the power and agency of those most affected to create a more inclusive society. Next slide. And so before we came up, we decided that we wanted to figure out what are the things that we are committing to do as a big driver for the work. And so we really want to radically reimagine, what our work can do and what our work needs to be. And one of the things that came out of our conversations is that we want to envision thriving, self-determinate Black communities in Illinois. As we were having discussions with people in the work, one of the things that continually came up is that there has been, particularly from philanthropy, a really historic disinvestment in terms of the way resources are put out the door in supporting Black-led and centered work that happens, particularly from a social justice approach. And so for us, we wanted to make that a priority in our grant making. We commit to, make sure that truth and the acknowledgement of the historic, structural, and racial inequities and the institutional harms that have impacted Black people, particularly those harms perpetuated and exacerbated by philanthropy. As I've already shared, there have been a number of reports that have come out in the past few years that looks at the actual dollars that are committed to not just social justice work, but social justice work that's led by and focused on Black organizations and Black communities. And so we really wanted to make sure that that gets embedded as a high priority in the work that the foundation is going to start doing going forward. We wanted to make sure that trusting the work, word, and experiences of those directly impacted by racial inequity and anti-Blackness is a core part of how we engage with communities and people who are working directly on the ground. And we also wanted to make sure that we rethink what does the word accountability mean. Historically, accountability has been about what grantees are accountable to philanthropy for. We say accountability is also about how are we making sure that informed and impacted communities are understanding that foundations are accountable to them as well. And particularly us in making a commitment to do this work, we see our own accountability as being driven by what communities are telling us they want and need, and whether or not we are being reflective and responsive enough to that. We want to make sure we have a wide variety of engagements to connect, inform, and spark partnerships. We want to have as many participatory practices as possible as a part of our outreach and our grant making that sees decision making, particularly those to impacted communities. And we want to be intersectional to make sure that when we talk about doing work that is racial equity and racial justice focused, that we are allowing people to be presented and doing that work in their full selves, recognizing that there are multiple systems of oppression that people are working with and dealing with on a regular basis. And so gender identity, class, disability, and immigration status are also really key in terms of how we make sure work is happening and supported by the foundation. Next slide. And so ultimately, we had to come up with a new theory of change. And so as I started off by saying, economy, education, Elgin, engagement, and environment has been how we have historically at Grand Victoria thought about our work. Under this new strategy, that approach is going to end. And so as the quote on the slide says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so one of the things that's going to be really important in the work that GVF is going to start funding going forward is that these little boxes that we required people to check in order to obtain funding from us are going to go away. We don't imagine that, there won't be opportunities, that people will be doing work that is focused on changing the economy systems that we have, or the educational system we have in Illinois, or figuring out ways to engage people to exercise their right to vote and, environmental justice. But that's not necessarily the way that we're going to be approaching or thinking about the future partners that we have. Next slide. And so to the meat of it, our theory of action. So ultimately what we came up with are 3 themes to be able to kind of center the work that Grand Victoria is going to start funding in the very near future. We want to, as I've already indicated, acknowledge the long-standing work of Black-led and centered organizations. So they will become a priority in terms of how Grand Victoria is going to be putting dollars out the door. Our goal is for those investments to remedy historic disinvestment by philanthropy in those organizations and their missions. But we also understand, even if you are funding the work of an organization, that does not necessarily repair the harm that has happened, and frankly, put those organizations on a path towards success. And so we also want to make sure that investments that GVF provides is also focused on this idea of repairing the harm of long-term disinvestment. So we want to use a regenerative approach to grant making that ensures Black-led organizations are fiscally, structurally, and culturally healthy. What does that mean? That means we're also, in addition to general operating dollars for the work itself, also going to figure out ways that we can provide supportive resources. That could be dollars, that could be connections, that could also be us figuring out ways to support via direct programming, the idea of organizational sustainability, helping to figure out ways for organizations to be supported to create sound back offices and operations. What are ways we can invest in the people in those organizations? Folks who are doing social justice work know, particularly as evidenced by the last couple of years, that work is hard and heady. And so creating opportunities for us to support the emergent and experienced professional development needs of the leaders in this organization, and also create opportunities for things like sabbaticals. Because one thing that we know is that if the work is hard, people often need to be able to step back. In the nonprofit sector, the idea of taking a sabbatical is pretty non-existent. And so if foundations can help to create opportunities for organizations to fill spaces while people are able to step back, to relax, to regenerate, and to refresh, to come back to do even better work than before, that creates a way for us to have healthy organizations that are on the long-term road towards success. Finally, in terms of the theory of action, we wanted to also make sure that we are investing in a sound ecosystem. And so we want to build and strengthen the field. When we talk about building and strengthening the field, we're talking about that in all aspects and all ways. So we want to create and support strong relationships amongst folks of color, so that they can create optimal conditions for building collective power. But we also want to encourage white organizations to reimagine how they might utilize their privilege and their work to be able to support racial equity and racial justice alliances, and to be able to center the goals of folks of color over their own in ways that creates a strong collective field of people in Illinois that are really pushing to have racial equity and racial justice as strong tenets in any and all work that they might do. We are right now in the midst of trying to operationalize what we recognize are big, heavy plans. And so one of the things that we have kind of made a commitment to do this year is to both evaluate our current grantees that we have on the portfolio, identify those that are going to be in alignment with the theory of action that I've shared with you today, and also identify those who are not necessarily ready to make that jump with us, and provide exit grants to those grantees so that we might be able to free up new dollars for new organizations that we anticipate will be coming into the fold, and we will be supporting their work in the very near future. I am, in my new role with the foundation that started last month, going to be leading a statewide landscape analysis that's going to be focused on identifying all of the organizations in Illinois that are doing systems change related work, but particularly those organizations that are Black-led and centered, both because we obviously want to know who's out there and where, so we can figure out where opportunities investment can lie, but also because we want to be able to engage philanthropy, our colleagues as a whole, and figure out ways we can help them to identify and make investments in people who are doing systems change work in ways that they may not have been able to do before, either because they didn't know that they existed or didn't necessarily know how those kinds of investments would be useful. We see a big part of our work isn't just focused on identifying and funding people, but also identifying and helping to support the field of philanthropy to engage differently, to think more strategically around how systems change work can be really important, and then most importantly, to rethink how we engage and support folks who are working in the field. The final thing that I want to share, thank you so much, Tess, for putting the link in the chat. There's another document that we have uploaded on our Google Drive. It's basically called the Racial Equity and Racial Justice, Our Journey document. It gives a little bit more context on some of the work that we've done in the past year and a half, both in terms of our thinking, our approach, just kind of give people a little context. And then finally, this is the Grand Victoria Foundation's website. As I've indicated, this year for us is really about planning. In 2023, we anticipate in the first quarter releasing the new guidelines. If you go to our website and you sign up to join our mailing list, you will be one of the first to be given an email to know what the new guidelines are going to be, how you can apply, and whether or not the work that you're currently doing or you are looking to doing in the future matches with the new direction of the Grand Victoria Foundation. So I'm looking forward to Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, thank you, Angela. That was so inspiring and interesting. As we shared in the chat, all of these presentations are being recorded, so you can dig into all of these rich resources later on. I certainly want to take a closer look at several of the pieces that Angela mentioned, so thank you so much. Next up, we have Suzanne German, Director of Reinvestment at Landmark, Illinois.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today, and thanks to the other panelists. This is really interesting, and it's great to see what changes are happening. I'm Suzanne German, the Director of Reinvestment from Landmark, Illinois, and I am, just a little background on me, I am from a small town in upstate New York and found myself in Chicago about 26 years ago. I was staying for 2 years for graduate school and, fell in love with the city, fell in love with the boy, got married, house, kids, and here I am, still here, loving Chicago, loving Illinois. one of the great advantages of my job is that we are a statewide organization, and I get to hop in the car and drive around the state and go to communities and meet people within their communities and see how we can support them. The next slide, please. Landmarks Illinois, if you are not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is people saving places for people. So we are really trying to preserve historic structures, and through doing that, support people in preserving their communities and economic development. We are a membership-driven organization, and I've been here with the organization for about 18 years. In various different roles, and I've been in this position for about a year now. Next slide, please. As you've seen and heard, many organizations are going through, in 2020, we looked at our values and saw that we really needed to update and look at our guiding principles. And that's what's on our screen here. And through that, in looking at what we really wanted to do and how we're guiding our organization into the future, and looking at justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, climate change, lasting relationships, honest stories, transparency, we really discovered that we needed to look closer at our organization and at our programs and making sure that we are meeting these principles. We created a DEI collaborative of various folks from whether they're on our board or volunteer to help us through this process, to be our mentors and guides through this, to ensure that we really are meeting these principles and evaluating each of our programs. I run 3 programs for the organization: preservation easements, where we protect about 540 historic properties throughout the state through a legal agreement, our grant program, and our reinvestment program. And I'm going to talk more about our grant program and reinvestment in this presentation. Next slide, please. We currently have 3 grant programs, and I'm going to announce to you today our 4th, which will officially be announced at the end of the month. So you are hearing this first here. So hopefully there's some folks in Southern Illinois who will be excited by this. One of the things that in looking at our guiding principles, people define inclusion and equity differently in different parts of the state. It depends on your community and who makes up your community. So we're looking at our programs and being statewide and making sure that all of our grant requirements are being equitable, and how we review them is equitable, putting everyone on the same playing field. We make our application process extremely simple. It's all online, but if somebody does not have that capability, they can file by paper. We accept things by mail, unbelievably still, but we try to make the process as easy as possible. And all of the grant applications are exactly the same, so that if somebody doesn't meet the funding requirements for one grant, we can bump them to another, to try to keep, we never want to say no. We want to say maybe later, or how can we help you in a different way? So we try to keep our toolbox very full and our funding sources very full as well. And I'll go through each of these grants to let you know what they each are. Next slide, please. The Preservation Heritage Fund is our largest fund. And when I say largest, it's about $60,000 a year. So still pretty small, but this is a statewide program. So anyone with a historic building in the state of Illinois would be eligible for this. And this is kind of our catch-all grant program. It's for bricks and mortar, it's for studies, it's for pretty much anything that you are doing with your historic building, and how we can support you. The grants are small. They range from about $2,500 to $5,000. We see them as seed grants to either get a project started, or to help you with your fundraising by saying Landmarks Illinois they're backing us, maybe you can too. Or we fill a gap at the end of the project. So it's really just $5,000 is on the outside, is on the high end of the grants. there is a one-to-one match for all of our grants. And we review these quarterly. This is one thing that we're looking at internally is to be equitable, does it make sense to review them quarterly? Are we comparing people only in this quarter? Should we be looking at our time frame of that? So these are some of our internal studies that we're doing to ensure that we're being equitable. And these dates may change, but so look at our website for any updates. But currently it's January, April, July, and October that we'll be reviewing grants. The next application is due on April 15th. So if anyone sees anything interesting here, be sure to check out our website. The next slide, please. Our other statewide grant is the Donnelly Preservation Fund. And this was a gift from our donors, Barbie and Tom Donnelly, gave us a chunk of money to use for a grant program. And this is similar to the Heritage Fund, that it's for nonprofits and municipalities, but it is not for bricks and mortar. It is for studies and educational purposes. So oftentimes folks will apply for the Donnelly first, do their feasibility study, do their conditions assessment, and then come back in a year and apply for the Heritage Fund to actually do the work. We do repeat grants over the years. You cannot apply or receive a grant within the same year, but we have worked with folks for over years to get their project completed through various different grant possibilities. These grants are a little bit smaller. They range from $1,000 to $3,000 a year or per grant, and we review them twice a year. Next slide, please. The next two grants that I'm going to talk about are more specific geographically. So the Tim Ewell Black Fund was created in 2020. And for those of you who know Tim Ewell Black, he recently passed away at the age of 102, but he was a civil rights leader on the south side of Chicago from Bronzeville. And to honor him in 2020, we created a grant fund in his name, specifically for the south side of Chicago. And these grants we have about $10,000 a year, so the grants are reviewed quarterly. The dates on that slide are incorrect. We will review them quarterly, and they're usually $2,500. These can be used for bricks and mortar. We're pretty wide ranging in what we'll consider for a grant for this fund as well as the Heritage Fund. And like I said, if someone applies for the Tim Ewell Black Fund, we don't have enough money in our pot, we'll bump it over to Heritage Fund to see how we can fund them. And our next grant, the next slide, this is our brand new grant, which we will be announcing. And this is specific to the southern region of Illinois. So you can see we have 19 counties that will be eligible. Projects within those counties will be eligible. And this is a little bit different in that the applicants don't need to be nonprofit or municipality. We are looking to support commercial property owners as well. The main goal of this is to create economic development. So we are looking at commercial corridors in these towns and how we can support them in saving their historic structures. We are partnering with Banterra Bank. They reached out to us and said, how can we work in our communities together and partner? So this is a first for us to have a partner in and helping us to, the way we see it is they're going to help us to know where we should be going, where should we be looking, and who to be reaching out to. And they have offered then to also help these grantees financially as well, how they can through loan programs, et cetera, through their own toolboxes. This will be, our first round will be in July, and we're expecting the grants to be about $2,500. We'll review those grants twice a year. So keep your ears open. April 26th will be the official announcement of this, and we will be in Marion making that announcement. So if anyone is in that area, just drop me a message in the chat and I will be sure that you are on our mailing list to come join us for the announcement. Next slide. Our other tool that we have, and this is a brand new program as well, Like I said, I've been the director of reinvestment for about a year, and that's about as long as this project's been going. We wanted to open up our toolbox to have the ability to offer loans or possible property acquisition, other sources, ways that we can support folks besides our grant programs. We currently have about $250,000 in this fund that we can offer out in loans. And that photo there, Art on the Nines, is our first project in the Chatham neighborhood, and they just closed on their loan just a month ago. It took us a long time to get here, both of us having a learning curve on this, but I am excited to get this kick-started and move it along. We're currently focused in Chicago, but I am excited to make it statewide and see how we can help folks around the state with these different tools that we have. And our next slide, please. None of our work is possible without our corporate funders. So if you see anybody on there that you want to support, who will then support us, great. Next slide, please. And I'm Suzanne German. There's my email. Take a look at landmarks.org/grants, and you will see the information about all of our grant programs. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, any specific questions about them as well. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's always great to have breaking news on our capacity building workshop. So thank you for that. Next up, we have our own Mark Hallett. He is the Director of Grant Programs at Illinois Humanities.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I agree, Morven. I've been taking notes frantically as you all have been sharing so much insight and really candor into your own thinking and how it's changing and evolving. But as Morven said, also sharing quote unquote breaking news, which is really exciting. Next slide. So I'm Mark Hallett, Director of Grants Programs at Illinois Humanities. I've been at IH for 7 years, since February of 2015. Let's see, lifelong Chicagoan, except for 7 years in Brazil, Mexico, Norway, and Spain. I was at the McCormick Foundation as a senior program officer in journalism for many years, for actually over 15 years, doing grant making in free speech across the Americas, investigative reporting, working with community and ethnic media, and then working intensively with youth media in the city of Chicago. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here with all of you who are in on today's workshop. Next slide. Great. So I'm going to share mainly information on our basic sort of longstanding community grants program, but then talk a little bit about some upcoming news and then some of the ways that we work with cultural leaders from across the state of Illinois. So Illinois Humanities, as Gabe said at the top of the program, has been doing grant making since 1974. I think we've made a combined almost $18 million in grants over that time period. This is still called the Community Grants Program, but it's changing. In fact, in the last 2 years, it's changed quite a bit with the current team that's working on this, which is really exciting. So the mission is that we believe that providing support to smaller cultural groups across the state of Illinois for planning, programming, and partnerships will help bolster individual organizations, strengthen statewide cultural landscape, and make public humanities and civic engagement. A lot of what we fund has a civic engagement lens to it, more accessible to everyone. Next slide. So just a little bit of an overview of the basic sort of 3 categories of grants within community grants. So we have 3 deadlines a year in January, May, and September. We work first with an LOI, which is a letter of intent or letter of inquiry. And we basically do that so that it's more accessible, it's easier for groups to apply initially and then move to a full proposal stage with select applicants. Basically, in a typical grant cycle, we get about 40 LOIs and whittle that down to about 20 applicants at the full proposal stage, and then end up partnering with 10 or 12 or more grant applicants after that. The whole process takes 8 or 9 weeks or so. So the 3 grants sort of buckets are Vision, Action, and Multiplier. Vision grants are basically for humanities organizations, and we'll share a list of what we mean by humanities organizations for planning purposes, for succession planning, for evaluation, for diversity, equity, and inclusiveness work, etc. And those go up to $2,000. And then Action and Multiplier grants are often awarded to humanities organizations, but they're also wider, meaning that sort of purely arts-based groups or groups doing civic engagement or community-based organizations can also qualify. So the action grants are really the bulk of the grants that Illinois Humanities makes in the community grants program. And these are for projects or initiatives. We really try to encourage risk-taking, whether it's trying something new out in terms of engaging with audiences or trying to reach new audiences or using new, say, digital tools, etc. And those grants go up to $4,000. And then the final category, and these are our largest basic grants, are called multiplier grants. And those are for more ambitious partnerships. For example, an action grant might be for a single library, but a multiplier grant might be for 6 or 7 libraries working in partnership with one another. And those go up to $8,000. Next slide. So just quickly, an example of each. A vision grant, the group Chicago Books to Women in Prison wanted to take a look at how well they were understanding the needs and desires in terms of reading of incarcerated women. Obviously, they're stakeholders. And so they held a series, they did a survey and held a series of focus groups and came out of that process with a much clearer idea of the interests of the incarcerated women in Illinois that they're working with. And it really helped them also to streamline the work that they do. The group 826 Shy, also in Chicago, did a DEI initiative at the organizational level and came out of that with much clearer stated goals, et cetera, in terms of anti-racist work and social equity. In terms of action grants, the group Chicago Poetry Center created a digital curriculum to help public school teachers infuse poetry into classes at a number of age levels. That curriculum is now available to groups across the state. The Lawrence County Historical Society produced a really remarkable film, An Eagle on His Button, which focuses on Black residents of Lawrence County who actually fought in the Civil War. And it's a remarkable film. It's PBS ready in terms of length and quality and is really amazing work. And then finally, the multiplier grants, and we could give a whole number of examples. Forefront, which is formerly the Donors Forum of Illinois, hosted a peer skill share for humanities groups across the state. And it's basically an exchange where if we in my organization find that we're lacking in some skill set, let's say that we're weak on hosting virtual programs, for example, and your organization is really strong at that, then we would work together and I would learn from you and we would each be compensated for our time as participants in the Skillshare. Another example is the group StoryCorps, which used to have an office at the Cultural Center in Chicago, and they did a series of oral history projects in Robbins, Illinois, which is a suburb, south side suburb of Chicago, predominantly Black, really remarkable history, and also a series of oral histories in Alton, and then hosted virtual discussions among participants. It was really amazing. Next slide. So then another grants bucket within the community grants program are the Activate History micro grants. So these were launched, I guess, just as the pandemic was emerging, getting underway in March of 2020. And what we heard from people across the state was that there are many community historians local stewards of archives and collections who didn't see enough funding opportunities for them to work on their collections, but also to engage with audiences around them. And so we created this program. Then there are 2 cycles per year. So we've actually only had 5 cycles to date of the Activate History grants. They're $500 per project. It's in everything that we do, we're trying really hard to simplify the bureaucracy, the application forms, the reporting, et cetera. And so this is an example of that, where we've tried really hard to whittle it down and streamline the process to what we really need to know to make a determination. And this takes less than a month to determine funding from the due date. Next slide. Eligibility with Activate tax exempt organizations. With all of our grants programs, there tends to be a leaning towards smaller organizations. In fact, 3/4 of our grantees have annual budgets of $300,000 or less. Individuals can apply for Activate History micro grants, and as with all of our grants programs, for-profit businesses are not eligible. Next slide. And then the question of what we consider an archive or collection, and we tend to take a pretty broad definition. They can be traditional archives or collections, oral histories, interviews, photos. We've worked with a number of photojournalists who did significant work, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Public art, stories, and collections can be digital or material. Next slide. And then a couple of examples of projects that we funded recently through Activate, and I'll just walk through one. Jose Luis Benavides discovered this remarkable exhibit that took place, I think, in 1977, Anishinaabe Wakiatzlan. And it was a coming together of Latinx and Native American artists and activists to produce a really, what we understand was a really amazing exhibit at Truman College, and then traveled around the state of Illinois at that time. Well, a number of the people who originally created this exhibit or participated in it are still around. And Jose Luis brought together archives that were in scattered sort of sites and hosted a virtual event of all of these people who, whatever that is, 40 something years ago, 50 something years ago, had worked on this project together. And it was just a really remarkable event and celebration and sharing. Next slide. So other grants programs, there are a number of things happening. We've had a really busy last 2 years, as some of you may know. One is in the Envisioning Justice initiative, which started back in late 2017, where we work with artists and humanists to help people imagine a future that is actually just. And so that EJ, or Envisioning Justice, has had grants initiatives every year. I think Illinois Humanities has given out, I believe, $400,000 or so over the last 2 years. So in terms of breaking news, we've just made an activation kit micro grant program available. I wonder if the link could be dropped into the chat. I can't really see it right now. But that has a May 6th deadline. So if you're interested in seeing some of the prompts that have been created by artists and humanists and hosting dialogue based on them, please take a look and don't hesitate to share any questions at all. Secondly, the last 2 years have been obviously hard for many organizations, many communities, many families. So we've had significant packages of grant making and at the statewide level. So I think in 2020, it was roughly $700,000 in grants to organizations across the state. Last year, it was basically even about double that amount. We issued a report on Wisdom and Vision in March of last year on how we saw sort of the state of cultural partners across the state of Illinois at that time. We're actually going to be releasing perhaps not as ambitious, but sort of a follow-up report in the next month or so, which we're really, really excited about. And we've learned a lot through this ambitious grants process, and have, obviously been able to partner with 500 plus organizations overall across the state of Illinois, and very much in every corner of the state. And then finally, in terms of breaking news, we're going to be sharing very soon a new rural initiative. And so thanks to the support of a private donor, we're going to be working with, through grants and working with through shared programming, a number of rural communities and cultural partners across the state of Illinois. This is going to be launched, I think, in the next 6 weeks or so. So please, if that sounds like a community that you're a part of, stay tuned. And again, as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. Next slide. And then quickly, just, we can't stress enough how much we value our partners and our partnerships and our relationships. So I wanted to share just a few of the ways that we at least strive to work with our sort of cultural partners across the state of Illinois. One is that through this experience offering general operating grants, and it's been great to hear some of our colleagues talk about this, but we are going to be launching a Gen Ops, or unrestricted grants, offering later this year. Vision grants, of course, are all about planning and helping to make your organization stronger. I'll be really honest, we don't get many vision grant applications. So if you're thinking of some sort of planning process, etc., please don't hesitate, reach out. Feedback on proposals. We really encourage people to share proposals before they've been submitted, or to reach out to us if a proposal hasn't been funded and you want to know why. We try really hard to be an open book and to share feedback. In terms of communications, we try to work closely with grantee partners. We did several workshops in 2020 on effectively using social media and hosting virtual programming. We also do a spotlight feature of one grantee partner every month, and we try to use social media to help leverage the events that you have coming up in your announcements, etc. We make stipends to help accessibility happen for grantee partners. And so that might mean that you hire someone to do translating or to do American Sign Language interpretation at an event. It also might be that you need busing to help get people to an event, for example, or that you need, child care at an event, which is really wide open, but about 2/3 of our grantees take advantage of this offering. And so these are stipends of $100 to $250, and it's something that we've found really helpful. We partner with Forefront, again, the Donors Forum of Illinois, or that was their old name, to do grant searches. So if you're a grantee of Illinois Humanities and you'd like a search on statewide giving in a given area or theme or field, let us know and we can do a search, have them do a search for you. We're actually doing some interviews and some post-project report forms by interview. And so if that's something that you would benefit from, feel free to reach out. And it's something we've just started and are finding it really helpful. And actually we learned quite a bit from doing this. Facilitation training is something that we've offered grantee partners since 2017. It's extremely popular. I believe that we have some room in a training in mid-July, maybe the 14th and 15th. If this sounds like something that you're interested in, please stay tuned. We'll be letting people know. And then we convene grantees after each grant cycle. And then finally, this isn't on the slide, but we have a next workshop coming up in June that will be a very hands-on workshop on proposal writing. And so if that sounds interesting to you, definitely keep an eye out because we'll be letting people know about that soon. Next slide. And then we just wanted to share a few resources. A number of the folks on this call have talked about how they're trying to center equity in terms of their work. And these are questions that we take really, really seriously. in striving to fund under-resourced communities across the state, whether they're in Chicago or rural, whether they're, for example, BIPOC-led entities, et cetera. These are things that matter a lot for us. We understand that the world of philanthropy has been so off kilter for so long and in so many ways, and has caused such harm. So we're paying close attention to resources that are coming our way. And we'll share this out later with this PowerPoint, but in case people are interested, there are some really remarkable videos, books, blogs, et cetera, that are really helpful in thinking and framing some of these issues. Next slide. And that's it. We care about our partners. Thanks, Morven.
Thank you. What a great list of resources there, Mark. So in just a few moments, we will take a quick 5-minute break. And when we come back, we will do a Q&A panel with our speakers. So as you're taking that break, feel free to put some of your questions in the chat, and we will do our absolute best to get to all of them. It's currently 2:14, so we'll come back from break promptly at 2:19. So see you all in a few minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you to those who are putting questions in the chat. There's some really interesting prompts and topics coming up, so we really appreciate that, and we'll try to get to as many as we can today. So one question that, or one theme that I noticed came up among each of our speakers, which is really great to be, hearing people talking about equity and how that is informing their work and their practices. But I wondered if this could be a moment of learning for us as nonprofits, since you all get sort of that bird's eye view of what nonprofits are doing to advance equity in their practices. It's increasingly a question on grant applications. Are you seeing any trends in terms of how organizations are working to advance their practices? And do you have any advice for, we have a lot of small organizations on the call who might be, inspired by the work that you all are doing, who want to advance their own internal equity work or equity in their programs, but don't have a lot of resources? And this is sort of for the group, so I don't know maybe if anybody would like to kick that one off.
I'm sorry, was that for the funder group?
Yes. Yeah, these are great questions.
Okay.
Yeah. These are questions for Angela, for Mark, Dan, and for Jerome.
I'm happy to kick off the discussion. So yes, this is actually a conversation that has come up a lot in terms of the work that I've been doing at GVF. Everybody has their own definition of what is meant by equity, racial justice, and the like. And a lot of people are trying to figure out ways to incorporate that kind of work in their approaches, whether you're a foundation or a nonprofit. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to figure out how we can help to support journeys. And so, for example, we have a grant with Forefront focused specifically on that very question. So Forefront is doing work this year where they have convened a number of organizations from philanthropy and also the nonprofit sector to really kind of have those kinds of inquiry and conversation, both to be able to get a sense of who's doing what where, but also to figure out what resources are out there, what are ways that we can have a common understanding. But we also know, as someone stated earlier, in different parts of the state, that word means different things. And so how can the work be reflective of those changes? And then probably more importantly for folks on this call, what are ways that free resources and supports can be provided? And so Forefront is in the middle of trying to answer all of those things.
That's really great to know, Angela. Thank you. Mark or Suzanne or Jerome, anything you'd like to add before we go on to our next question? Great. All right. Well, we have another question for our four-person funder group here, and this is a great one that I have certainly had as a grant writer. And this person writes, my question relates to evaluation. Most grant applications ask about it, but for arts and humanities organizations, our impact is sometimes difficult to easily quantify. As funders, how open are you to more qualitative measures of impact, and what advice do you have for how we can best communicate our impact? And maybe we'll toss it to Mark. Do you want to start that one? Just put somebody on the hot seat here.
No problem. Thanks, Marvin. Thanks, Marvin. Yeah, that's such a great question. I think our thinking has evolved a bit. I mean, we partnered with an outside team for quite a while on evaluation of grant-funded projects, as well as civic dialogues through a program called Illinois Speaks. And I would say that in some instances that was really useful, where groups had specific thoughts around how they wanted to measure impact and were able to sort of harness some of the thinking of the folks we were partnering with. In a lot of cases, it was a disconnect, and it was something that we were hoping to see. And I think it was actually really problematic and strained for our grantee partners to carry out. What I think we're more interested in today is documenting. You know, if you've carried out programs, collecting the resources you've created. In some, we always ask about evaluation, and it's not to be heavy, you know, fisted or whatever handed about it. But we want to know what people are thinking in terms of programming or the coming year, if it's general operating work, what sorts of advances they'd like to see, what questions they're asking, and what kinds of indices would help them know if they're advancing at all or not, what lessons they've learned. So I think we're at a point right now where we've backed off a bit and are still really interested in the question of impact. But we're trying to see ways that we can have those questions arise from our grantee partners and not from us imposing them, if that makes sense at all.
But another one of our funders like to chime in. I'm sure evaluation is on everybody's final reports.
I'll go.
Angela.
So I shared a lot about how our grant making is changing, and didn't get a chance to share that everything that we're doing is changing. So like many foundations, we're going to move away from requiring that final reports are written. We would be open to having an interview, and, you know, or even the application. It's going to be less about a formalized way of talking about your work, and more, you know, based off of how you believe you are showing impact and evaluation, or how your partners are able to show that you have impact. And so, you know, I guess the long way that I'm saying here is that we're trying to be as flexible as possible to have a wide variety of ways to think about that question.
That's great. I really love to hear that. Question for Jerome. If you were to highlight 1 to 2 of the other funding areas that you shared that the Arts Council agency is working on, considering that this is a room of cultural leaders from across the state, what would you include to highlight 1 or 2 other funding areas?
Funding areas. So our focus is arts and education and artists. So as I mentioned, in terms of organizations, we work with arts organizations with a broad understanding of the arts. And then we also work with different organizations. Someone was asking, can a library apply? For instance, a library can apply to have one of the STARTS grants that we're talking about, where you can bring a teaching artist to do a series of hands-on workshops. So we work with arts organizations and also other organizations, depending on the grant program. And then we also work with schools for education, like with the AFL grant program. And we also work directly with individuals, artists. So there are different areas. Every program sort of touches on a different purpose. So mostly a lot of our work goes towards arts organizations and artists, but also non-arts organizations can find programs to apply to, like the STARTS or the Arts Tour Live Music is another one. So does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's great to hear about some of those other areas of funding. This question is for Suzanne from Vanessa in the chat, and I love this question, Vanessa. Would a non-for-profits who deal with universal design or for accommodations for persons with disabilities, is that encapsulated in any of the areas of Landmarks funding?
All of our funding has to be associated with a historic building. Great. So if it doesn't matter what the use is, if a nonprofit is, it doesn't matter what the nonprofit's mission is, as long as they are trying to preserve their historic building or repair it, rehabilitate it, maintain it. So that's really the one factor. The one thing that needs to be there is the historic building.
That's great, Suzanne. That's really clarifying. And then I think that'll allow us to sort of quickly get through this question. If you have a resident, an old building, so it fits that requirement, but it's been altered, even if it's been altered in its history, if it's still a historic building, it would likely fit within Landmarks criteria.
Yeah, all buildings have long lives and they have various histories. So, it depends on how, many uses happen over time. And as long as the community is still using the building and it's a project that is, like I said, rehabilitating or bringing that building back to life or keeping its life going, then it would qualify.
Great. That's a really beautiful way of looking at architectural spaces. A question for Angela from the chat. When you and Grand Victoria Foundation are thinking about policy work and systems change, is that at the city, state, or federal level, or all of the above? Are you thinking about systems specifically in terms of formal policies, laws, regulations, or also more informal systemic change, with something like narrative change, for example? And thank you, Marty, from the Chicago Poetry Center, for asking that question.
That is a really good question. So we support work that would impact the folks who are living in the state of Illinois. So all of the above. Some of our current grantees do local, state, or federal level work. We have a long-standing relationship with the folks at the HANA Center who are, hugely involved in work at the federal level in terms of immigration change. We support a group called Mano a Mano, who does work in the northern suburbs, who are focused on engaging the immigrant community in the northern suburbs to really have a monumental shift in terms of the kind of local electeds that are happening there. And so for us, we do not discriminate in terms of policy, where it is, and how it is linked. And yes, to your other question, in terms of formal, so yes, we obviously, as I just gave definitions about formal policies, laws, and regulations. And in the new grant making that's going to start next year, we will start doing informal systems change, because I failed to talk about embedded in that second strand that was called repairing harm will be work that will be focused around narrative change, which is this idea of how do you engage media and the broader collective around ways that anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racial equity and racial justice thoughts and approaches impacts the broader discussions around particularly communities of color and Black communities in the state. So yes to all of that.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And I definitely encourage folks to do check out those Grand Victoria resources. What they're doing has a lot of depth and nuance. And so they really have dug into a lot of these specific areas where questions are coming up. So thank you guys for that. just a reminder to, yeah, keep those questions coming. They can be for a specific funding organization or they can be for the group. One sort of interesting sort of thought-provoking question that came up is for all of our funders in the conversation, are there any funders or funding collectives right now that are thinking about how to provide health insurance for people working at small nonprofits? Well, my own small nonprofit does barely pay for health insurance. Many of our peer organizations are unable to. This is a major equity issue, and many people simply cannot afford to work at small nonprofits, even if they have a desire to do so. So I think this is a really interesting question and does get it. I mean, I love the vision that Victoria Foundation has of like supporting nonprofit professionals to take sabbaticals and things like that. So I think it does kind of get at that quality of life and making sure that, you know, all the wonderful people on this call today can, you know, sustain that work. So wondered if you folks knew, if Mark or Suzanne, Jerome or Angela, if you know of any resources, and then just, you know, had anything to, you know, contribute to this. Is a pretty interesting question.
This is more. Yeah, I'll jump in real quick and then I want to hear what others are thinking. I mean, I would say that this is fundamental. I mean, when we look at community-based arts, community-based cultural work, and I love the way Tempest Hazel has described cultural work as the quiet organizing. It's about such important, deeply rooted and relevant community-based work. When we think about this work happening at the community level, it's too often underfunded. And I would say that we organizationally are sort of new to this issue. And what I'm thinking is that the emergency relief grant making that we did in the last 2 years has helped us to begin to understand how many of our partners are actually volunteer-led organizations, right? And that's I mean, that's wonderful. That's to be celebrated. People are amazing. That's also a problem. I mean, we want to see pipelines that are sustainable, and we don't want to see burnout, right? So I want to thank the person who asked that, because whether it's artistic work, cultural work, humanities work, organizing, we need to see sustainable avenues to keep people growing and engaged and involved. And so and the one resource that came to mind was that we've talked with a staff person at Collaboration Theater in Chicago, Elsa Hiltner, who's doing work around compensation in the arts community. And I'm not sure whether her research delves into questions of insurance or not, but we'd be glad to ask her for that resource and share it out with folks later if that would be helpful.
Great, thank you, Mark. When you were about to, Jerome, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll add. I think, yeah, that the questions of health insurance and the vitality of organizations is essential, and I think that's one of the many motivations behind focusing a lot of our efforts towards general operating support. That allows organizations to prioritize their own needs, and yeah, I feel general operating support is a fantastic way for organizations to do things such as provide healthcare to their employees. We don't mandate it. We let organizations run the way we should. The way they think they should. And every year when organizations come for general operating support, we see the evolution and they get reviewed on that. And we also have the people reviewing applications are people from the field themselves. So we reach out to peers in the field to review organizations. We have pretty diverse panels from across the state with different organizations come in and kind of given that input and help organizations progress that way through general operating support. So yeah, I think those are fantastic questions to ask and very important.
Yes, general operating grants are essential, as are indirect expenses being included in grant budgets. So thank you guys for reflecting on that. Another question for Suzanne. Could you speak briefly about sort of the number of grants that Landmark gives per year, or sort of like what your funding pool is? I think we heard that from some of our other funders, but I wanted to sort of get that sense of that scale at Landmark too.
Yeah, our Heritage Fund is our biggest grant fund, and that's about $60,000 a year. We usually give about 15 to 17 grants through the 3 grant programs. So like I said, they're all small. Our total fund is, $80,000. So not that much money to give out. I ask for more every year, but it doesn't happen.
Thank you for doing that. And then one other sort of follow-up to that is, if you are, does the organization in sort of offering resources or capacity building, if you are sort of the steward of an old property and don't necessarily know how to start to do a feasibility study, how to, get any of those folks in place, I think we're artists and humanists and not necessarily like architects and engineers on the call. So how do we start those kind of exciting projects?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just one of 10 staff members, and the grants are just a small part of what we do. Our advocacy team they travel around and meet with people to talk about how to help you. Oftentimes, usually our most popular call is from a church saying, how do I deal with this huge structure, small congregation? And we're seeing this across the state and nationally, it's a big issue. So we do a lot of pro bono work that we will send out to our, a board member or somebody who has offered to volunteer, who works with as an architect or an engineer, to go and help an organization that doesn't have the funds to do a feasibility study. We work with students to line them up to also help to do these kinds of studies and plans, so that they're in a position to seek more funds, whether it's through us or through a federal grant. A lot of federal grants require certain kinds of designation and certain kinds of background information in order to ask for that money. So we try to get people in the position that they can ask for larger amounts of money. We're working with the church right now that through pro bono services, we've gotten them a conditions assessment. We have a student working with them to designate the property to make them eligible to seek additional funds. So grants are just a small portion of what we do and how we help. So certainly if anybody has a specific question, please reach out to me, and I will, if I can't help you, I will get you to the right staff person to get you going.
Thanks. We have one other sort of specific question in the chat for Angela at the Grand Victoria Foundation. So this is would a BIPOC person with disability-led nonprofit who deals with intersectionality and advocacy issues in Chicago be eligible for Grand Victoria? And of course, I do want to preface that Grand Victoria hasn't released those those new application question pieces yet. So this may be a check back in 2023. But it sounds like if you're dealing with those advocacy issues, it would be worth checking out those resources when they become available. Would you concur, Angela? Anything to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say once the new guidelines come out, it'll be a lot easier for people to determine whether or not they see themselves in the work. I would say that we definitely have made plans to be sure that there, as I said it before, in the PowerPoint, that there is an intersectional approach to the work that we fund going forward. So there could be some opportunity, absolutely. But again, if you go to our website, sign up to receive alerts from us, you'll be eligible to get the email that gives the link to the actual guidelines once we have them complete at the end of this calendar year.
Great. And then one of the other questions that came up earlier, which is again sort of in these issues of equity, and it's great to see this group sort of thinking through this and asking these provocative questions, was about have funders considered inverting the typical model for how award sizes are determined. So normally it's, the bigger organization you are, the more money you're eligible for. They're sort of suggesting that, hey, we're a tiny under $100,000 organization. We get the $1 million, and then the $1 million organization gets the $10,000. And they say that this seems to be a very straightforward example of enacting equity to give more resources where it's needed and fewer where less is needed. And I do, before we toss that to the group, I do want to point back to some of those resources Mark shared. That is definitely, a question that is going on in the field of philanthropy. I would point you to Decolonizing Wealth. I would point you towards Nonprofit AF. So yeah, you're definitely pulling at a string that is present in a lot of folks' minds. Has anybody heard of somebody using that kind of model, that inverted model? Or have anything to add on that? I think it's just a great question or comment.
Yeah, so I saw this in the chat. I was hoping we would get to it. It's a great question. I would say yes, but it's complicated for a couple of reasons, right? So speaking for GVF, we try to fund based off of need. And we also try to, sometimes I have personally tried to push grantees to say, think deeply and broadly around what it is you can accomplish and how we might partner with you to do so. That being said, we also need to be mindful about a concept called tipping. And so this is something that they don't talk a lot about with the nonprofit sector, particularly smaller groups. There is a danger that if you receive too much funding from one source, you could be tipped and not be able to keep your nonprofit status. And so that is kind of sometimes the balance that funders are thinking about in terms of limiting how much dollars they are able to give to a smallish organization. And these are actually the kinds of conversations that we've been having internally, because many of the organizations that we've identified are small, have small budgets. We'd love to give them a lot of money, but we can't. And one way that we try to balance that is to identify other funders to bring them to the table to be able to also give, which allows us to give more.
Great answer.
And I want to jump on what Angela was saying. I think she's right about a sustainability question there. That's important, and diversifying revenue streams for an organization. And one thing that brings up to my mind, I think a lot, is feedback that we get often from organizations that do receive funds from the Arts Council, is that seems to open doors to receive more funds. And we fund small organizations to very large organizations. We're public funding, so we're available for any organizations that meet the eligibility criteria and that submit complete applications that are reviewed through our panel process. And it does seem that receiving funds, at least from the Arts Council, and I think it's probably similar for other funders, it sort of brings legitimacy to what the organization is doing and helping the organization receive more funds as well. So, I mean, we fund organizations that are volunteer-based, and we fund organizations that have multi-million-dollar budgets. And we think that's the most effective way of being present in the state and recognizing the tremendous work that all these organizations are doing to contributing to the vitality in the state of Illinois.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jerome, that even one grant can really help secure momentum going forward. So thank you. I think we'll take maybe one more question and then start to wind down. So this question comes to us from Children's Theater of Elgin, and getting back to that topic of general operating grants, and absolutely that there tends to be more project grants and program-based grants without corresponding general operating grant growth, which is necessary to carry out out the work. And I think we all sort of hear that point. But the second part of the question is, did any funders present provide emergency funding for COVID? And in so doing, see the effects of providing general operating funds? And what are your recommendations for securing general operating funds for nonprofits? So I am going to throw this to Mark, because I know that we at Illinois Humanities, we have provided a lot of COVID relief funding, including some general operating funding. So if you want to, say a little bit about some of our learnings from that, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Morven. We've learned a lot over the last 2 years, and a few of the takeaways on an institutional level. We learned that we have our own bandwidth that gets stretched really thin when we're doing high volume grant making, and so we are now using a platform called Foundant, which is a lot easier for us. It's not 100% perfect, but we're getting good feedback from grantee partners about it. So that's made a big difference. I think the bulk of the grant making that we've made in the last 2 years has been GenOps funding. And it's basically changed us in a number of ways. Rather than using data just to look backwards at what we've funded, we're now using data to look at what we hope to fund, meaning we're looking at databases of what communities have less of a philanthropic presence, what communities are under-resourced historically, what communities have been harder hit by COVID. So we're now trying to harness data to help us make grant making decisions, if that makes sense at all. We're as I said earlier, we're going to be launching a GenOps grants category, which we hope to just continue to grow. I don't think we want to give up project funding altogether, and there's actually a reason for that. And that is that through projects, we're able to work with groups that aren't necessarily in their mission and core programming humanities organizations. And what I mean by that is the Calumet Collaborative, for example, and any number of other groups are doing economic development in neighborhoods that need it, but they see the benefits of doing oral histories or history work or doing some of the legwork that really helps bring people together with a shared sense of connection to place, history, etc. And so I don't think we're going to give up project grants altogether for that reason. But I was going to say more, but doing the emergency relief grant making has really changed our thinking quite a bit. And yeah, that's all for the moment.
Thanks. And is there any advice folks have about securing general operating funding for nonprofits? I was going to suggest, utilizing one of the resources Mark shared of doing that grant search via Forefront. Oftentimes, if you're looking for general operating support versus project support, that's something that would come up in your grant search process, or looking at the guidelines on a grantor's website. Anything else to add, you guys, about securing general operating funds?
If I can add one real quick thing, I mean, everyone has someone who has supported their organization at one time or another, perhaps repeatedly. If you are at a point where you have a relationship with people at that fund or at that foundation or entity, whatever it is, make the case for general operating funding. And I mean that to say that it's not often that you have a chance to shape how a funder can do a better job. But if you have that relationship and have the opportunity, make the case, explain why project only is actually really harmful to organizations. And the other advice that I would add is bake general operating support, i.e. overhead, i.e. salary, i.e. other expenses, into your project budget. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you can do it, you have to have the lights on or whatever, you have to have rent paid, you have to have people at the table to be able to carry out projects. So to the degree that you're able to include general operating support in what might otherwise be considered a project grant.
Thank you, Mark. That is excellent advice. So I'd just like to say thank you again to all of our panelists. This was incredibly informative, and it's so, I think, heartening to see how deeply you're thinking about all of these issues related to your funding, related to you're thinking deeply about the questions that our audience is raising. So thank you for spending this time with us today. Do we have some wrap-up slides? We may, because we have a couple of upcoming, as people have alluded to, upcoming capacity building workshops. And I think that beautifully ties into one of the last questions in the chat, which is from the Jackson County Historical Society, which is about, getting fresh money through the door to help them achieve their goals. So our next capacity building session is actually about applying for grants and has suggestions on like each step of that process. So I actually think that might be a really great place for your organization to start that journey. So lists of other workshops, our capacity building workshops coming up in the rest of the year will be also in the chat. We have also just linked our post-workshop feedback form. If you could take a couple of moments right now and complete that for us, it would be so beneficial. We hold these workshops to hopefully help and support and enable the work that you do, and we would so value your feedback and insights from this conversation. Another fun community event that we have coming up in May is our Public Humanities Awards on May 19th. It's a virtual awards presentation at noon that is totally free and open to everybody in our community. And we are going to be celebrating humanists from across the state, from Macomb to East St. Louis to Chicago. So as part of our Illinois Humanities community, I really encourage you to join us for that event and celebration. We also have, as Mark mentioned, some upcoming grant deadlines. Please stay tuned for, if you are a cultural organization working in a rural setting, for the opening of that opportunity in May. We also have some Envisioning Justice micro grants, which are available to apply for through May 6th, and more funding cycles to come. So do check out our Illinois Humanities website. And again, there is the link in the chat to the post-workshop feedback. We would, again, really appreciate you completing that. We hope to see you at our future capacity building workshops. Thank you all for being on the call today, for being so engaged and asking such great questions. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.